Good morning, everyone. Hello, and a very warm welcome to this session on inclusive urban transport planning for more equitable growth. And I'd like to ask everybody, before we begin, to please shut off your mobile phones so that we are undisturbed while we're speaking. And just a brief warning, procedural warning, we will have presentations in Russian and in French, so you may need translation headsets, unless you are very multilingual, and you do, I think, see them on your chairs. So do please avail yourselves of translation headsets if you need one. So I'm Melinda Crane, and it is a great pleasure to be with you this morning as moderator of this session. And we have a fantastic international selection of mayors and city authorities to talk with us about inclusive urban transport planning. As you know, 2015 produced a global sustainability agenda that has very profound implications for the transport sector in general and for urban transport in particular. Many people say the battle for sustainability, be it environmental or social, will be won or lost in cities. And certainly that is true when we talk about inclusiveness. Already over half of the world's people live in cities. Urbanization, as you know, is continuing at an explosive pace all over the world. And urban transport is critical to ensuring that cities facing such growth are vibrant, exciting, dynamic, and socially equitable places to live. To foster inclusion, urban mobility systems need to improve access, safety, and efficiency. Balancing those goals is not always easy, as I think we'll hear shortly. Initiatives to that purpose are taking shape, and we will hear something about best practices during our discussion in just a moment, but it's definitely going to take more to get where we need to go, which is why today we are going to be taking a look not only at goals and best practices, but also at the challenges and the gaps that cities are facing. So we do have a great panel to help us do that. I will introduce them in just a moment, and I hope that you will bear with me if I simply give you the names and titles of our guests today, because in fact we've got a lot to talk about in a fairly short window for doing so. So if you wish to know more, please do consult the summit documents for more details on their very impressive biographies. And we will begin with a presentation from a city that has taken enormous strides to turn what was one of the most car-choked, congested urban centers anywhere, rated by some as having the worst traffic in the world, into a place that is far more socially inclusive and also far greener. I am referring, I think if you were with us last night at the gala dinner, then you will probably know what city I am referring to. I am referring to Moscow, which yesterday won the ITF Transport Achievement Award in the passenger category for its initiative to get cars under control in the city center and to greatly expand opportunities both for urban transport passengers and also for cyclists. Something hard to imagine if you were in Moscow 5 years ago, hard to imagine how that could become a haven for cyclists, but it's happening, and that's what we're going to hear right now. Please welcome with me, if you would, the Deputy Mayor of Moscow, who will now present for us what Moscow is doing in the area of inclusiveness. Maxim Liksutov, the stage is yours.
Уважаемые дамы и господа, уважаемые модераторы.
Ladies and gentlemen, presenter, allow me to say a few words on the changes that Moscow has seen in the past. And in doing so, I would like to underline the topic of a maximum of mobility for people who are less mobile or mobility impaired. As for the extent and the scale of the transport system in Moscow, we have to mention that Moscow belongs to the largest cities in the world, and the transport system, as you can see here, is equally large. The historical boundaries of the city cover approximately 1 million square kilometers. Per 1,000 inhabitants, we have 324 cars on the roads of our city, and the area of our transport network per car is smaller in our city compared to other cities with a comparable inhabitant number. If you take a look at that slide, then you can see Tokyo, for example, where you can find approximately the same number of inhabitants, but only half the cars. But the space available, the street and road space available per car, is 3 times bigger than in Moscow. And the number of trips taken by public transport per day are 15.7 million people, which is a figure that we're proud of. And in the course of my presentation, I will tell you how we achieved that. Until 2010, the transport system of Moscow had barely been moving, and one of the most important demands towards the newly elected mayor of Moscow was to improve the transport options in the city significantly. That had to be part of his agenda. The priorities that we had followed until 2010 became rather untypical for such a large city, but the priority focused or had focused on private cars. Then public transport took up the second position, and to be frank, there weren't any developments there, and pedestrians and cyclists came last in the hierarchy of priorities when it comes to transport options in our city. By the way, should you wish to take a look at my presentation, I am happy to distribute it to you, and then you can read up what I'm talking about here. The mayor election in Moscow took place in 2010, where the priorities were then shifted. First of all, with international and Russian support, we designed a program, an agenda of change with new priorities for the development of the transport system in our city. Pedestrians and cyclists now came first. Next, there was public transport, and number 3 was private passenger cars. I'd like to mention that even after shifting priorities, the number of new cars between 2010 and 2015 still was on the increase. We counted almost 1 million new cars, and of course this also has an effect, and it put our transport system under pressure. Now I would like to talk about our targets and tasks that we had set ourselves from the outset, tasks and targets that we are trying to achieve and solve together with our citizens. Of course, we set ourselves very strict KPIs, and we're trying to follow up on them in a rather strict manner. And one of them is the share of public transport in our daily passenger flow. 2010, this share accounted for 58% of all trips taken in the city, and until 2020 we want to increase that share to 71%. Of course, quality of transport services is an issue. This includes our subway system, our metro, which is very important for our city, and this is why we've set ourselves the task to increase the number of passengers' seats in public transport, something that we have already succeeded. And we offer almost 4 million seats, and until 2020 we want to see further growth by an additional 36%, which means 34 million seats per day. The average travel times in peak times, this is a figure, a benchmark that we chose considering the economic and geographic features of our city, because 30% of our jobs are located at the center of our city, and of course we focused on that. We tried to shorten the average travel time. Using public transport, people now need approximately, on average, less time, which is a task that we had set ourselves for 2020, because we want to shorten the travel times even more, and we want to make the trips even more comfortable, and we want to reduce the travel time by another 16%. Before the backdrop of all our tasks to also open up public transport for mobility impaired people. By the way, I just want to point that out. Only 34% of public transport used to be inclusive in 2010, and now we have lifted this figure up to almost 100%. We achieved that by replacing many buses. Now we use several low-floor buses that impaired people can use. We have added 15,000 new buses over the past few years, and that means that we have almost entirely replaced our bus fleet. Of course, environmental issues and emissions have also played a role, and we have realized that, of course, there is a need for change in Moscow. 94% of the Moscow emissions, unfortunately, are generated by transport. This is a historical reality that, among other factors, leads to a situation where the average age of private passenger cars is 10 years. The average age of public transport vehicles is 4.5 years, and that means that our bus fleet, for example, is the youngest even compared to other European cities. So we have an average of 4 years. On my next slide, you can see a few facts about inclusive transport. Out of 10 million citizens, approximately 800,000 have mobility problems, at least to the extent that they are registered in our urban system. And there were important legal regulations that were passed in Moscow so as to protect those citizens as good as possible and to make transport accessible for them. We are now obliged by law to reserve 10% of all the parking spaces available in the city for people in wheelchairs, people with disabilities, and the so-called social taxi was introduced and modernized. Here we're talking about transport services that bring people in wheelchairs or with disabilities from A to B for free so that they can enjoy life in our city, that they can go to the cinema, to the theater, to, I don't know, travel to their little gardens or see a doctor. I've already said that 100% of our buses are low-floor buses, and when it comes to our metro system, we have also established a special service that is called Mobility Center. If you know the Moscow metro system, you know that there are some subway stations that are located at a depth of 50 meters, and they were built in the 50s or 60s of last century. And currently, it is technically not feasible to have people in wheelchairs use our subway, and this is why we decided to establish this special service in our subway stations where people in wheelchairs are accompanied. So while they are traveling on our metro, here we're talking about approximately 400,000 trips a year, they are accompanied by our special service. As for people with disabilities, we have decided to develop urban transport, interurban trains, metro, in a way that it can be used for free. Another important issue is, of course, the environmental issue. Of course, we also want to have a sustainable and livable environment, and this is why we passed another agenda, another scheme. The entire transport system is to be as environmentally friendly as possible, and I can tell you now that over a period of 5 years, air pollution in Moscow has declined by 5%. And 10%, excuse me, and until 2020, we want to increase that figure to 45%. This is our target that we want to reach by developing urban transport. We want to reduce the number of private cars on our road. We want to get people into the public transport system. And as you know, we have a well-established bus system. We have many buses traveling through our city, and we have established a rather large program to develop more means of transport, trams more than anything. I would like to seize the opportunity and give you an idea of our changes to make them more feasible, tangible, visible. Unfortunately, I'm already running out of time. But I would like to invite you to our Urban Forum in 2016. It takes place on an annual basis in Moscow, and here you get a chance to take a very close look at our urban transport policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Deputy Mayor. If you will just take that seat right there. Darf ich unsere andere Panelistin bitten?
Our other panelists, please come on stage, and then I will present you to the audience.
Very much. Mayor Jung, if you'll join me here, and Mr. Papandreou, if you'll come over here. Very good. Yes. So it's a great honor to introduce our geographically diverse panel, and I begin here on my right hand with the mayor of the beautiful host city of the International Transport Forum, namely Leipzig, Burkhard Jung. A great honor to have you with us, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning. And then we have here on the outside of the panel, from your point of view on the left, Louis Nègre is president of GART. It is the French Association of Transport Authorities, and he is also mayor of Cagnes-sur-Mer in southern France, and also holds a position in the city of Nice. So wonderful that you can be with us, sir. And seated next to him is Ruud van der Pleuk. He is Secretary General of EMTA, which is the European Metropolitan Transport Authorities Association, and he has also held senior positions as a transport planner for the city of Amsterdam. Wonderful to have you here as well. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Timothy Papandreou. He is Chief Innovation Officer for the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Authority. Great that you could make the trip to be with us. I'd like to start out by asking all of you to tell us a little bit about best practices, positive initiatives, either in your cities or in your regional associations, that can give us a sense of what is happening to improve accessibility for vulnerable users. So what is happening now that's exciting, that's working, that's effective to increase inclusion either in your city or, as I said, amongst your association. And I'll start here with Leipzig, Mayor Jung, and Leipzig was fervently praised yesterday evening. I think perhaps you had already left the gala dinner, but Jack Short, who essentially brought the ITF,
I've heard about that, yes.
brought the summit to Leipzig, said he was astonished at the progress that had been made to make Leipzig increasingly vibrant. What role has transport, and particularly transport for the vulnerable, social inclusion, played in turning Leipzig into such a livable city?
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, I think transport system is very important in the development of the city, because our city now is growing very, very fast. In the 90s, we have had a situation of going down, 100,000 people left the city. And since 2000, it's growing very fast, and now it's the fastest growing city in Germany. We won in 10 years 100,000 people. So it is important to have ways and strategic plans to organize mobility. Individual cars can't be the answer of this development, because you talked about that, emissions and was ist das Wort für Stau?
Traffic congestion.
Traffic congestion. We have a lucky situation. We have the second largest tram system in Germany. And so the first and important thing is to strengthen the tram system, to have new trams, Niederflurwagen, I don't know the English word about that.
Low floor trams, improving accessibility.
And to strengthen the pedestrians areas, to strengthen the bicycle lanes. And so we have an increasement of bicycle from 13% to 20%, and my goal is to have 25, in the year 25% part of the modal split of biking. So that are the main goals. To strengthen the public traffic, the pedestrian traffic, the bike modal split. And new ways are proved. For example, I have to look on my paper. A technical innovation, e.g. Easy Go for public transport information, traffic information in the internet, on the highway, to have a very easy way to find the right traffic instrument for yourself. At the tram station, you can choose between biking, taxi, car sharing, or to go by tram. So that's the new innovation center. We have 25 points in the city, and we will look about that, how will be the participation of the people.
Thank you very much. Perhaps just one follow-up question. I was quite interested to see that Leipzig has run what it calls a citizens' competition, a Bürgerwettbewerb, to try to get ideas from the grassroots into the transport planning process. Can you just say a word about that and what you've been able to find out about what your citizens want?
Yes, we have the plan was to have a great big master plan to develop the traffic system for the next 10 years. And so we decided to make a great big citizen participation in public forums and so on. And I think it's incredibly important to do that. Maybe it's for the first few, you will have complications, because you need time, you need personal, you need every month we have had public forums, and everybody knows better to do it than we. But at the end, there's an anticipation in the citizenship, and they notice, okay, there are many different things to think about. It's a very complicated system to have the right for pedestrians and bicycle and economic traffic and parking and to have, for example, space for a double buggy on the trottoir. And for example, in the concrete planning of one of the most important roads in the city, the secret of the success was the participation of many people in this street. We act for 1 year with the people in the street, and at the end, everybody is saying, yes, it's not only my favorite thing, but I understand.
Thank you very much. So improving public acceptance also as part of a process of inclusion. Let me now go to southern France and ask about experience in the Cagnes-Nice region, perhaps best practices, examples that you can share there and or from GART members in general. Louis Nègre.
Merci, Madame, chers collègues, chers amis.
Colleagues, friends, I think there are two levels to that, two levels for our activities, so that we have the opportunity that all those who have impaired mobility can have a way to have an active part in society. So at a national level, a large number of laws have been adopted where the municipalities and local authorities are basically made to make adoptions and to adopt traffic, to adapt traffic. And this is true for all ways of traffic, anything that moves. We've got a timetable, we've got a timeline. That was in 2005. It was in 2005 where we at first didn't achieve our aims, so we had to put that off a bit. But now we've got a timeline for every mayor, and every mayor is now obliged to take measures in line with a certain plan and timeline. For instance, all traffic stops, all stations will have to be designed in such a way that people with impairments, handicapped people, will still have access. So tram stops, bus stops, stations have been redesigned in such a way that also the visually impaired can have access. In Nice, there were some delays in the implementation of that plan. However, from the very outset, we had tram systems where low-floor trams were used. It is, in fact, since 2002 that we've had those low-floor trams. And also the tram designers were asked to implement the guidelines which were stipulated by the authorities, so that people with impaired mobility have access everywhere. We really had to put flesh to the bones of that. The members of parliament and members of municipal councils had to look at the details so as to guarantee access. We've low-floor cars for buses as well as for trams, so that people with impaired mobility basically can have access and that their demands are met. You can put your name down in a list, and then you have the right to use taxis. And the taxi will come, and it will be a taxi which has been adapted to your kind of impairment, and maybe even a person to accompany you. And we guarantee door-to-door access. This is a taxi service which works very well, and we want to develop that further for the whole city of Nice. We've got a system for the whole conurbation of Nice, and all people with impairments can make good use of that system, so that everybody has the opportunity to use public transport. We have lowered the price, the ticket prices for the public transport system. It's not a realistic price, but for every kind of distance, for whatever distance you pay, €1. Would you believe it? €1. And okay, somebody will pay, ultimately, that is true. But this makes it possible to transition from one mode of transport to the next. And this has made it possible that we have developed a transport which is accessible to all and which links all modes of transport. So we have taken measures so that we could also set up a car sharing system for the others as well.
Talked about that as being an essential element of promoting accessibility and inclusion. So just a word, if you would, about the role that that plays.
Alors, sur la communication, là aussi,
communication is key, of course. And this was important for city councillors and city councils. In the metropolitan region, we have more than 40 different communities with their municipal councils, and we communicated well with them. There were posters, there were information brochures and leaflets, and we also worked together with the most important organization, which we have in our region, for paralyzed people, where we have started communication campaigns so that everybody is being informed. And this communication approach is something that is very important for us. When we have people with impaired mobility, we have to inform them and accompany them from the word go, and everybody is affected. Elected representatives, decision makers in transport, families, and of course, persons directly affected. For them, we have special services, and the public at large as well.
Please tell us something about best practices and rewarding effective initiatives, either within the EMTA or also, of course, in your home city of Amsterdam.
Thank you very much, Melinda. Talking about inclusiveness, the first thing that jumps to mind with me is having people included in different market segments and different groups of impaired mobility requires that we level with them on the level of communication and IT. And I would first like to say that there is a very daring law taken in, for example, in Copenhagen, which 2 years ago promised that every single piece of information would be digitalized for everyone, so on a generic level, which was supposedly to raise a lot of resistance. And in the end, after 2 years of very good marketing and promotion, was accepted, and in the phase of implementation only generated about 8 complaints still left. Because the thing was, at the cognitive level, the assumption was that the elderly, which constitutes an ever-growing, increasing part of our society, would not comply with that, would not be able to use their smartphones properly. But in the Nordic countries, there's a little bit of a cultural difference compared to the rest of Europe, for anything for that matter, because digitalization and digging into the opportunities that public transport and all additional shapes of individual transport on the basis of door-to-door or even chair-to-chair transport for people with impaired mobility can take up using good communication and displaying all the different opportunities there. So that's the Copenhagen issue. I really envy the Nordic cities, and I have to mention that we cooperate as EMTA with practitioners in the project called BEST, and I think it's one of the best, maybe not even close to what is going on in other cities, because they select, that is the practitioners from the Nordic capitals. Every semi-annual year they have an in-depth analysis of what the customer orientation demands from the transport systems. So to assess what is the customer satisfaction on different levels, also from inclusiveness and specific parts. So that's something to be envious about, and maybe also to replicate in other cities. As far as Amsterdam city, I really live in and work for in the city region concerns. It's now becoming, and that has to do with governance and also the level of ownership and planning from public transport. It's the transport authority on itself, but also the municipal operator becomes aware that they have to comply with, I call it the hybridization of the structures in public transport and in governance. Because you can't keep away the development of popping up, bottom-up initiatives from startups, from brokerage initiatives, from IT level to align demand and supply. And of course, I don't want to mention the "oo" word every time once more, but it is something to be aware of, that people on the individual level make their own choices, and make their own choices from a wide array of opportunities of capacity. As the Secretary General of this organization, International Transport Forum, has displayed with the opportunities that offers in, for example, modeling the Lisbon situation with a simulation project, as we heard this week. In Amsterdam, they have a new project called ABEL, or ABEL. Maybe it's not a coincidence, but it's called ABEL in Dutch. And there, to my surprise, as of January this year, the municipal company of GVB, Amsterdam, offers on their website and on their communication apps opportunities to reserve first and last mile solutions tailor-made to the individual needs and impediments of some travelers. I think that's a promising development, and I really hope that it will not end with a trial situation. We are very good in the Netherlands to develop trials, but if you want to see how it's going to be scaled, that's sometimes a different story. It's not really thought through when people take up trials for specific groups. And another example in Helsinki is the Kutsu Plus, which is an additional offer of services for, well, in general, every urban inhabitant, but mostly people that need assistance from chair to door and door to door in a seamless situation. And there it failed because the local municipality was not prepared to subvention on the longer term for every passenger using it, 20 euros in the end per passenger additional, starting off from 100 euros deficit. So you have to make a business case and think through if you can build a business case for that for the longer run.
Thank you very much. And a business case is exactly what we want to talk about in a second round of questions, but let me just stay with best practices long enough to now go to North America. The OO word was not quite mentioned, but we are going to the city where the OO word started, San Francisco. San Francisco likes to think of itself as an urban laboratory, it says its website. What kind of experiments are being done in the urban laboratory when it comes to accessibility and inclusion? Bearing in mind also that San Francisco is a place where there are a number of indigent, a number of homeless, and a very strong divide between those who have and those who do not. So perhaps you can say a few words about that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Melinda, and thank you very much for having me. Our Mayor, Ed Lee, sends his welcome, invites you all to San Francisco to come and be with us, and our Governor of California also gives you welcome. So San Francisco has been going through tremendous changes in the last 5 and 10 years, and we are by now one of the wealthiest cities in the country, with also the largest divide, as Melinda mentioned. We have grown our economy in the last, what was projected in the next 20 years, we've reached in 4 years. And so our economy has grown so fast that our infrastructure hasn't caught up. And so we have an affordability crisis in San Francisco right now. It's the most expensive place to live in the US, more expensive than Manhattan in New York. I think it's more expensive than most cities in the world. The average one-bedroom apartment right now is renting for nearly $4,000 a month. So it's very expensive for new people moving into the city. And so we have a lot of challenges to deal with, and our infrastructure, our traditional infrastructure, whether it's public transport or any other infrastructure, it takes too long to build because the society is changing so quickly. This is why the Ubers and the Lyfts and all of the car sharing and bike sharing has exploded, because they're trying to capture existing capacity in the system and provide that supply service immediately. Even though our plans take 3 years to go through the very lengthy environmental process that we have, our community engagement process is so lengthy that it takes 3 years to approve a transport project. In those 3 years, our society has changed. And so we need to shift that environmental, that 1970s style environmental process to 2016 style immediate gratification. And how do we make sure that we do that? So what we've done is very similar to what the speaker said. We engage our public immediately, and we have a very large social platform where people can contact us and let us know what's going on. We ask them to engage us. And some very specific examples is we had a lot of crowding on our transit system. It's very crowded in the morning, and people are waiting in line on the bus. And so we asked them, what's the best way to fix this in not 6 years, but in 6 weeks? And the best response was, allow us to enter the bus from any door. And so that was a big change for our engineers. They'd be like, why would we do that? You should come from the front door. But we actually offered to open all the doors now, and we reduced our traffic times by 20%. Anybody can get on the bus now, anywhere, just like a subway. So now the subway and the bus has the same time to get on and get off on the vehicle. So that was quick and cheap and free. And also helped us improve our customer access, because now people in wheelchairs can get on any door where there's a platform. So that was the first thing we did. The second thing is we declared a crisis. We said that we have a problem with traffic, collisions and fatalities. So we adopted the Swedish Vision Zero program, but for a city, not for a national highway system. And so now we've been doing very tactical urbanist things. We mark out space on the street with paint and with bollards and with posts, and say, this is the space for people for walking now, and our capital program will catch up 3 or 4 years later, but at least we have it now, so that the people can see the changes now. And we've also done some very interesting things. In 2010, 60% of all of our trips in the city for work and for everything else was by car, and 40% was by public transport, walking and cycling. For a US city, that's very good. We're the most European city in America, or the most American city in Europe, right? So it depends where we are. And so, but that was 2010. With all of the changes that we've done the last 5 years, we reached 50-50 in 2015. Unheard of for a US city to have half of its trips by car and the other half of the trips by collective transport. That's not enough for San Francisco. We're now going to go to 60-40. 40% of all trips by car and 60 by collective transport. And we're going to do that through our social engagement process. We have 6 major languages in San Francisco. Everything we do is multilingual, number one. And number two, it's not just high tech. You know, we're the innovation capital of the world, but we also do low tech things. We've changed our transport map. Most transport maps have 30 colors. And if you're colorblind, you can't tell the difference between green and red. And so now we have just 2 colors. Red means everything comes every 5 minutes or less, and blue means 5 minutes or more. That's all you need to know. 2 colors, blue and red, it matches anybody's eyes, and they can see how the system works. And the other thing that we've done as well is we have actually worked with the companies, whether it's car share or bike share or Uber or Lyft or Zipcar, the systems, to say, how can you be part of our transport system? So we have shifted our focus from being a transport agency to being a transport platform. So we are now a platform, and we invite the companies in under our rules. We set the rules very clear that you must meet accessibility requirements, you must meet affordability requirements, you must be available everywhere, not just a boutique service. So we're trying to get them to come in under the expectation that here are our minimum social values that we have, and together we can figure this out and solve those individual issues one by one.
May I just ask you very briefly, because I was quite intrigued to hear Ruud van der Ploeg say that they discovered the digital divide was not as great an issue as they thought it might be, at least in Scandinavian countries.
Yes.
How is it in the home of
technology.
digital language? Have you actually, is that an issue that you have been focusing on?
So one thing that we found is that more than 78% of adults in the Bay Area have smartphones, which is 4 years ago, it was 68%, and in 5 years, it'll be 100%. And those that don't have smartphones in San Francisco just don't want them. Not because they can't afford, they just don't want them, right? So they don't like them, they don't want them, fine. But the issue we found is that even though the majority have smartphones, a good proportion cannot afford the data plan. The data plan costs a lot of money, and after 6 months, they drop out of the data plan. So we have a new program. Rather than saying digital divide, we call it digital equity. And our digital equity strategy is 100% free Wi-Fi coverage for all of the city. Because if people can get access to Wi-Fi for free, they can access all the data in the system. And every single one of our services is digital in San Francisco. So that's a social inclusion platform through digital equity that we have.
Thank you very much. So let me now move on to that business case that was mentioned just a moment ago, because of course, one thing that urban planners everywhere face is tight budgets, financially strapped planners who then have to balance financial, economic sustainability and social sustainability. And a challenge in that area, of course, is making the argument for greater expenditures for mobility impaired and low-income users. So one big issue, how can you capture the benefits? How can you make those benefits part of the discourse when it comes to making that business case? And I'd like to ask all of you to just say a word about whether you have faced challenges in this area. What have you done to try to put the gains out there? What kind of arguments have you been able to make in order to make a case? For example, for that amazing Moscow statistic that you gave us, moving from 34% accessibility for mobility impaired to 100%. How did you make the case for doing that, Deputy Mayor?
Уважаемые коллеги,
Dear colleagues, I use English less and less, so please excuse me for once again speaking in Russian, but I promise that when we meet next year, I will speak in English, so please, sorry for the inconvenience. Well, the challenges that we face in Moscow are quite typical for cities. The colleagues that have presented here face similar problems, and we call it the problem of mega cities with more than 10 million inhabitants. Those are cities with their own problems due to their size. And when developing our plans, be it mobility plans or other plans, we were quite successful in copying examples or analyzing examples from other large European and American cities. And of course, that helped us to design our transport program, our transport plan, including inclusion, and it allowed us to design it in such a rather comfortable way. Okay, now to your question. In Moscow, until recently, it used to be quite difficult for mobility because the transport system was closed and it wasn't really open and accessible for people with disabilities. So as to start somewhere, we started with an analysis and did that together with the Disabled People Association and did a survey on the routes in the city that mobility impaired people use most. And subway trips were mentioned, bus trips were mentioned. And on that basis, we identified priorities and tried to focus on the places where mobility impaired people would like to use public transport, and we tried to start from there. And on those subway stations, we used trained staff capable of dealing with people with different disabilities so as to assist them. For example, we have 200 stops in our metro system, and on 88 stations, we established special services. That means that trained people are there to assist people with disabilities from their entering our subway system to their leaving it. That was our first incentive. That was the first time that we opened up for people with disabilities and demonstrated that indeed it is possible for them to use the transport system. That's an individual service, an individual approach that made it possible for us to speed up the process of including disabled people and getting them used to their being able to use public transport, to getting them to believe that it is possible for them to move around our city by public transport. And on the level of the federal government, a few laws were passed directed at bus or subway manufacturers, and they are obliged and have been obliged since 2012 to manufacture accessible cars only. In Russia, currently, it is prohibited to manufacture cars or wagons that cannot be used by disabled people, so they all have to be low floor. Next, I've already mentioned that 10% of the parking spaces are reserved for cars used by people in wheelchairs. You just have to log on to a city portal and electronically, and then you can use those parking spaces. And another innovation that we want to implement in the near future is another mobility offer. We do not have as many smartphones as San Francisco, but approximately 60% of our citizens use smartphones in our city, and we will develop a program, an application, an app that suggests routes usable for people with impaired mobility. This is an application that selects the shortest or most comfortable route for this group of people and make individual suggestions. And once again, public transport is for free for people with disabilities in our city. And on top of that, we try to give an answer to the question of where the money comes from. I think we found a simple solution. We didn't start within our budget. We didn't start with municipal companies. We didn't try to shift money from them to other sectors, but we established a different individual slot in our budget that is dedicated to the support of disabled people. It comprises approximately 7 million euros per year spent on that. And this is our budget slot that stands for our social obligation vis-a-vis this group of our population. And we said this budget slot will stay the way it is. We will never touch it. And over the next 5 years, this is the way it will be. And this is the planning phase. Thank you very much.
So one very important point there at the beginning, a needs assessment, looking at the demand, trying to get a clear picture of what needs are out there. Mayor Jung, how have you been able to make the case for improving accessibility, and how have you been able to measure potential gains and bring that measurement into discourse?
For me, it's very an important point, political point. So, if it's possible to use your headphones. Ich bin zutiefst davon überzeugt.
I'm convinced that the quality of a society is demonstrated by how that society deals with minorities, how that society deals with people who, due to their physical or mental or social impairments, how they are accepted in the system. So in that regard, I am very happy that in Germany the legal situation is such that people with disabilities have special rights, such as transport for free or accompanying children. And if you accompany a child with disabilities, then the person accompanying that child can travel for free. But the problem is funding indeed. And the question also comprises standards. We only had one chance. We had to restructure the public transport infrastructure and had to turn it into a social infrastructure because in GDR times, that field had been neglected. Just to give you an example, we have a wonderful tram network on which trams travel that were not suitable at all for people with disabilities, be it physical disabilities or visual impairments or mental impairments. And of course, we try to replace those cars step by step. Behind that, there is the strategy that we try to stick to the standards with every new measure so as to make sure that people can travel independently in spite of their disabilities or impairments. So there are systems for blind people that help them to get their bearings. Color blindness have to be considered. The hearing impaired, for example, they cannot hear or receive certain signals. So when crossing a street, for example, you have to organize that. You have to find suitable forms for people in wheelchairs. But the essential question, ladies and gentlemen, is, or maybe a few words in advance, it's a step-by-step process on the basis of replacing existing systems, and there is no alternative to that. But the real issue is, how far does the standard take us? Is it really necessary to build a ramp with a length of 20 meters so as to have a certain inclination that doesn't go beyond a certain percentage? Do you really need self-opening doors in schools so that children visiting that school can open the door without asking for help? Is it really necessary to establish an identical standard in every school, or can you focus on something? This is a question that's not entirely clear to me, and I sometimes have the feeling that we're exaggerating. Just to tell you a little story.
I built an old people's home, and we wanted to make sure that the distance between the wash basin and the toilet bowl has to be designed for very large wheelchairs and should be 1.10 meters. And for 15 million euros, that old people's home was built, and the distance turned out to be 1.05 meters. And that was not at all important because wheelchairs still had access, but we had to completely redesign that old people's home, as all wash basins had to be replaced, and there were additional costs to the tune of 500,000.
A word about financing streams for inclusion and accessibility. We heard just now from the Deputy Mayor, they have a ring-fenced item in their budget that allows them to keep that untouched. What about Leipzig? How can you be assured of the financing that you need for, let's say, reasonable expenditures that are within an effective cost-benefit calculation for you?
Das ist unstrittig.
This, of course, goes without saying. Of course, for every new construction measure, we price in measures for handicapped people, and this is part and parcel of every kind of investment. Moreover, we have several systems for social inclusion, so we organize traffic accordingly. Of course, there is special transport for certain pupils which are paid for by health insurance companies and social insurance companies. The systems are becoming bigger and bigger, more intensive, and every year our costs go up by millions every year. The legislator in Germany now wants to remove some burden from the municipalities where the federal government pays for that, but I don't know when the system will collapse.
Provocative remarks there in terms of that balance between costs and benefits. Let me ask each of the rest of you to briefly address both sides. So making the business case, making the arguments, trying to clearly specify what gains you do see. And if you wish to reference what you just heard from the mayor about whether we've gone too far in the other direction, I'd be interested. And then also the question of financing. So once you've made that business case, where does the money come from? Monsieur Nègre.
Je me reconnais totalement dans les paroles de mon...
Yes, we've got the same problems with standards, as have already been mentioned. I'm a senator, and we founded a working group in the Senate so as to try to basically make sure that we don't have excessive standards anymore, and that we achieve the same kind of effect by different means. We believe that we have to be more pragmatic and less theoretical. We have seen that the other mayors have the same difficulties, and the national French legislation forces municipalities to implement those infrastructure measures and to keep them up to date. And some bad piece of news for municipalities and local authorities, the government in France cut quite a number of subsidies. So we are in a situation where we have to spend more, and at the same time we have less income and less revenue. To answer your question more precisely, I can say that financing public transport in France, and this is also transport for handicapped people, is a kind of financing which is paid for 1/3 by the users, 1/3 by the public authorities, and 1/3 by the companies. That is a system which makes it possible for us to work efficiently and to function in the first place, but there are difficulties, as I've mentioned, and there will be problems in the future, that is clear. Of course, the part which is paid for by the users will have to be increased so as to ensure financing. This is a political decision to be made as far as financing is concerned. The local authorities, the municipalities, have the expenses on local transport as a first item in their budget. So it's a basic decision, and with that basic decision, then opportunities have to be created to implement all that. Then there is a social issue involved. What are our arguments in favor? In France, this doesn't seem to be a basic problem, a general problem. The process that people become aware of this as a problem is a recent thing, but the French are now prepared to make progress in this direction. If you don't have anybody in your family who is wheelchair-bound, knows at least somebody who is wheelchair-bound. So there is a general awareness that something has to be done among the populace. In France, We want to pursue the respective policies, and there is consensus in France that those policies should be supported. Of course, it's a progressive progress. Of course, if you have a look at train stations, millions of euros have been invested and will be invested. And French society at large, the executive as well as legislative, see the problem. So that is not really a problem. We don't have a problem with awareness.
And if you care to comment on what you've heard just now, I'd also be interested, because essentially what I'm hearing from several of you is, yes, we need the national frameworks, we need laws that also essentially make the gains and benefits visible and obligatory. On the other hand, those are occasionally being translated into norms so rigid that we've gotten away from pragmatic functionality in terms of benefits and simply have rigid norms that become too constraining. Would you agree with that?
Yes, in general I do. Just to first have a look at the situation in the Netherlands, which is basically if it's about the fair policy for people, the users of the system and the revenues, the user principle counts. So everybody except for students, which are visiting high school and university, they are subventioned for free access to transport during the hours of outside and inside the peak. And there's now debates going on in the Netherlands if we should not expand this, because we are following up on the famous public transport chip card, which is a very old-based system of check-in, check-out. And if we should not to help different aspects of inclusiveness, like inclusiveness for the impaired, but also for people looking for jobs, because they have to look for employment, also facilitate either a lower price or free travel. But there is a collision with the economic aspect and the use case of the viability of these systems, because the capacity of the public transport system, mainly in Amsterdam, is not fit to have more customers, again, without, well, you could say, relinquishing the level of quality you can offer for people to sit down. So that's one of the main reasons that we try also in the train system in the Netherlands to refrain people from getting into the trains and travel during peak hour times, because, well, on the one hand, it causes insecurity and feelings of unsafety for people if they can't find a seat. But also it causes a lot of higher extra costs for extra capacity for vehicles. In the Amsterdam situation, we have a ring-fence budget for investments in not only implementing low-floor vehicles in the tram system, which constitutes basically the fine grid system, you know, for seamlessness, but also to invest in higher levels of platforms for buses. So we have to comply, so to minimize the gap, the vertical gap in the entrance of the trams mainly, and also the buses. And that takes about 60 to 80 million in the next 5 years. But I think if you look at what we just saw on the different take on how we going to comply with demands from people with impaired mobility and also seamless travel from door to door, maybe we need to rethink the way we have organized our mobility system and the financing and funding for that. Because in EMTA we just established a working group looking at the funding of the long-term funding of services of transport next to the future perspective of investments and capitalizing on that. I think we need to be aware to create a new ecosystem to guarantee value creations and capitalize on benefits for the near future. And that's my belief. I think the dilemma is now the individual car use is not so much deriving its value as a sole mean of transportation to bring people from A to B. It's some European cultures, and I only can talk about European cultures and not about North American or developing countries' cultures, of course. The ownership of a car still trumps access. It should be the other way around. And that's where most of these concepts are based on. So I think as long as the car still has a prevalent status, strongly fed by maybe, can I call it perception or emotion of having a car itself. It's a status symbol for a lot of people. That would create really an impediment to get to another way of thinking about the new ecosystem and to make emotions, which basically is a #1 pollutant, you could say, in that respect, undone or take it back. It will take a long time because it needs a behavioral adaptism and psychology, working on psychology of people and seeing that you can do. And not only if you're well-to-do or live in a city like Paris or Berlin or Amsterdam, where you have a lot of alternatives for the private car, but you can't do without a car and even build an individual optimum business case. But on the level of the collective transport, we're now looking at a research project that EMTA is involved in with 10 international partners on how we can look at an effective way of building a new adapted or redesigned transport system where mobility pays itself. And the user pays, that's the basic rule.
Thank you very much. So you said you're speaking for Europe, and in fact I was hearing gentle noises of assent from North America, as it were. So perhaps a few words from you on both sides of that equation, making the case for more, for expenditures for more inclusion, and then on the other hand, financing streams. What are you doing as an innovation officer in San Francisco?
So I think, one of the things I want to do is talk specifics, because we've been speaking a little bit in generality. So we talk about business plans in San Francisco. We think, breathe, and act and talk like a startup, because that's the culture that we have. So what's the use case? What's the value proposition? Why are we doing this? And who's it for? And if you can't answer those questions quickly and succinctly, you get laughed out of the room in San Francisco. So you've got to be very, very clear on what you're asking for. We've changed the conversation, though, because utilizing data is one way to change the conversation, but articulating that data in the way that people can understand is crucial. I'll give you a specific example. When we reached 50% of all trips by walking, transit, cycling, and sharing, and 50% by driving, we had a dollar value that we could attach to that now, because our public transportation budget is very transparent. Everybody knows how much we're spending because they remind us every day how much money we're wasting on the public system. And that's $1.5 billion a year. So with $1.5 billion a year, we're moving half of all of the trips around the city. No one had any idea what the private transportation budget was in the city to move the other half. And guess what? It's $5 billion a year. We found that information out and we said, look, for $1.5 billion, we can move half of all trips. And you're spending $5 billion, which 90% of that money is going to volatile economic regions, and we're wasting that money. It's leaving our local economy. We can bring that money back if we work on specific investments that target cycling, transport, and inclusive transportation, walking, and sharing. And that changed the whole dynamic of the argument, so much so that we have the authority in San Francisco to bond. We can bond ourselves for extra resources. And we raised $500 million under the assumption that if the public invested $500 million, we should be able to reduce the private transportation budget significantly. And that passed 71% in a city that doesn't like to pay for taxes, right? So it's changing the conversation, changing the language, and I take some exception to what's just been said, because disability and inclusiveness is a basic fundamental human right. And in San Francisco and in California, human-centered design is a right of design. And we have shown that through human-centered design, we save money, we save resources, and we save operating costs because of the things that we have done. And so it's absolutely, to me, a bright line. There is no exception to this. Where it gets a little silly is in the national regulations. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act that requires all of these steps. But we have a caveat, and the caveat says reasonable accommodation, within reason. And engineers can go a little wild if you let them go wild. So we bring it back and say, within reason, what does this look like? And one example is all of our intersections, when we change our traffic lights, we have to make the intersection accessible as well for wheelchair access. And we've factored out the designs over time to make it cost effective. But one example is Our bike facilities, we have bike storage. So the door now has become accessible for wheelchair access to ride a bicycle. To this day, nobody has opened the door with a wheelchair to ride a bicycle because they can't. But the law says you have to do that. So there's just some specific issues where we need to tweak and question. But I think making the business case is really effective in that looking at the total transportation budget and figuring out ways to reduce the cost for people. We have a minimum requirement, 18% of people's household budget in San Francisco is spent on driving. And if we can reduce that by 10%, we can increase the local economy by much more than that. And so that's our goal that we keep moving towards, is reduce the cost of transportation for everybody and increase access to mobility. Even though it doesn't feel like it's very cost effective in the middle, it does actually get you to the way you need to get to. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I would like to use the last 10 to 15 minutes of our session to take audience questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I think we have microphones in the room, do we? So I'll start here in the fourth row, then I'll go here to the also fourth row, I think it is. Thanks. So if you put your hand back up again, we'll start here, and I'll bundle questions. So over here on the right hand, rechte Seite, vierte, genau, der Herr neben Ihnen, genau. Und dann hier, sorry. Young lady, this man here also, please. Yeah, Alain Flausch, thank you. So.
Oliver Meach, CEO of the Greater Leipzig Regional Rail Authority. May I put up a word Mayor Jung has mentioned about the wide-span tram system in the city of Leipzig, which is one of the essential keys for a very good modal split, even though it could be better. Another factor is that we have a newly established light railway system which links the region with the inner city. And this is quite important, I guess, for all cities, because you are not only the city center, you have the regions outside. We call it in German the Speckgürtel, all the people living not in the city center, but profiting from city services. And so it's so important that you do not only have a system for the people within the city, but also for the people coming from the outskirts and going back to the outskirts. And so I think it's important to have this always in mind if you do some planning. And as the French colleague said, and I guess it applies a little bit also to what you have said from San Francisco, the financial instruments are very important. In France, you have the Versement de Transport, a very special financial instrument which says those who profit from public transportation, even if they don't use it, like companies which are happy not to have too much parking space for the vans of their staff, but for customers, for example. So it's important to get those who profited from public transport to pay for it. And in Germany, we are quite away from that. In the States, you have it in certain aspects, and in France, you are very happy. And so you can say only €1 for public transportation, because 60% of your budget is paid by employers who are profiting from the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, especially about the point of incorporating regions. In fact, that was on my list, but I've had to jettison a few topics. But I know that in the region of Leipzig, you have one ticket that is good for tram, bus, and I think also high-speed rail on all transport in the region. So a very important regional initiative there. Let me now take Alain Flausch's question, please.
Yes, good morning. It's just maybe not a question, but some sort of an argument that I want to put on the table. The question of funding is also very much related to the definition of what do we call impaired mobility. For the people who are really either blind or on wheelchair, it's not more than 3 or 4% of the population. So when you say, I'm going to spend millions for 3 or 4%, of course it needs, political support, it needs compassion, and I'm happy to hear that in France people are believing of this. But an argument that I've heard from Association of Impaired User is the fact that there are many more people who have impaired mobility. Sometimes the figure of 30% was raised. And you think in terms of one person having a luggage, or a mother with 2 kids, or a pregnant lady. You know, there are plenty of people who can take advantage of the new facilities that you're building for the real impaired people, the minority of them. And that is, I think, a good argument, because whenever you calculate the yield, a return on investment, on the top side, you have on the numerator, you have, of course, the cost. But then if you can divide it by 30% of your ridership, it makes the case much more viable. Thank you.
Thank you. And in fact, that was something I understood the deputy mayor to have told us, that it wasn't until they began to increase supply that they got a real sense of the size of demand. It's not until you bring people into the system and make them visible that you can even assess the potential gains. Thanks very much for that. So I had a question here in the second row, the lady. If we can get a microphone here. And others who had questions, please put your hands up. I have one also there in the 5th row, and also Mary. Good.
Thank you very much. My name is Monika Zimmermann, and I'm Deputy Secretary General of ICLEI. That's Local Governments for Sustainability. So we organize around the world the cities, and some of them are members, which are very concerned about their urban transportation and other issues of sustainable development. So we have coined the term eco-mobility to indicate a priority for walking, cycling, wheeling, public transport, shared mobility, and how all that works well together. So I want to thank the mayor of Moscow that you mentioned the inclusiveness, and you gave us data on the environment development or the emission figures. And I want to point out to the following development, which is a great concern for us. Although many cities try hard to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, even those which do very well as such still have increasing emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, from urban transportation. So we urgently need a very strong efforts to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions from urban transportation. And the answers to that are basically the same answers than you gave to the question of inclusiveness. So my pledge and my question to you is, and maybe basically to Moscow and also San Francisco, is how can you imagine we can best combine the increase of inclusiveness, accessibility, and caring for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, and, by the way, traditional air pollution as well, because this is what many cities hit very badly at the moment.
Thanks very much. Let me bundle a couple more questions and then we'll get an answer. So, Mary, if you'll put your hand back up, we'll get a microphone over to you. And also to you. Can I get a microphone here on the left and also there on the right, the man in the blue shirt? I think it's a blue, no, it's not a blue shirt, but anyway.
Andrei Berdichevsky from the World Economic Forum. Looking forward, what role do you see for autonomous mobility on the one hand side, and on the other hand side, the urban planning in terms of relocating services to the communities, rather bringing the communities to the services, so a cluster design of the cities?
Okay, thanks very much. And then one more, who's got a microphone over here on the left-hand side? Can you please give it to this lady here who's got her hand up? Mary, will you put your hand up? Oh, you've got it, good.
This lady here has a microphone. Yeah, Mary Cross from the International Transport Forum. I first of all wanted to support and actually express my own real pleasure to hear Alain Flausch cite these numbers. Very often, this whole problem is chalked up to 10% of the population. You mentioned 3. I mean, sometimes it's 10. And that's not enough to make the business case. And it's arguable that, as you say, Alain, it's not 10% of the population that's actually going to benefit from it. And at the ITF right now, my colleague Lorenzo is leading a body of work that's looking at better evaluation of the economic benefits of accessibility, the wider benefits of accessibility that are really felt and captured throughout the users of the transport system, which are not understood and properly articulated right now. So that's a big thing. But I also wanted to just respond to some of what I've been hearing about national legislative frameworks and make the argument that even when countries go to national disability legislation, we have a discrimination-based system in the United States, which can lead to litigation, et cetera, very, very quickly. We have in France, since 2005, a national disability framework for accessibility that's having some trouble getting implemented, but it is getting implemented. In Germany, I think there's been national legislation since 2002, about 2002 or 2004, dealing with accessibility of the transport system. But even when there are these national frameworks in place, very often, once the national government puts in the legislation, it steps back. And all of a sudden, it becomes a regional or a local problem. And there is, and I believe Mayor Jung, perhaps you were saying this, or was it Monsieur Negre, that there's no longer money to do it. So the funding capacity, the revenue generation capacity is not commensurate with the actual responsibility. And this we see right across even developed economies. It's not just developing or emerging economies, it's also developed economies. So my plea would be that once there's national legislation in place, that the national governments don't disengage, that actually continue to monitor and make sure that legislation and norms and standards are actually applicable and properly funded at the regional and local level.
Thank you very much. So I think I'm going to have to cut off questions and remarks there, but we will bring pedestrians into the answer to the ICLE question. So let me start out with that question. I think she was especially interested in an answer from both of you in regard to combining the socially inclusive and greener aspects, and then we'll come to the other two.
Well, I think, Monica was right on.
Ja, ich glaube, Monica
focusing on climate adaptation, and we're one of the first states in the world to really adopt aggressive greenhouse gas emissions, because we're tied to the economy. We believe we can have a green economy by also reducing emissions and improving efficiency. We've done that very, very well. But the bit specifically about inclusiveness and the environment comes down to what we call environmental justice. And communities that are exposed to high levels of pollution, both greenhouse gas and air pollution, tend to need the same things. They need cleaner transport facilities, they need more walking and cycling access, and better public transport. And it's universal across the whole world. I've had the pleasure of meeting with over 200 cities in my career, and we have the same problems at different scales. And it comes down to the same things of cleaner, greener transport propulsion, and then more demand management services. So that's really what we've been focusing on. But I also want to mention the fact that a lot of the conversation here is about how do we make that case, and we know that more than a third of our population has some sort of access issue, and most of it's invisible. A person who has severe arthritis in their back and their arms, you can't see that, but they can't actually go up and down certain steps and stuff. So understand that it's much broader, and it's also temporal. So women who get pregnant, it's for a short period of time, but they need that kind of inclusiveness. And on the emissions side as well, people who are less able to walk at certain speed, you need to make sure that the crosswalks will actually give them the time that they need to cross. Otherwise, they're exposed to traffic that could be dangerous. So we need to be a little more holistic and a little bit more integrated, and we can get to the answer of greener transport, but also more inclusive simultaneously. And it shouldn't cost more, because if you bring in the principles of universal design up front, and you have a lot more consultation up front, it's cheaper to change a plan or a map than it is to change concrete. So get the design right first, get the operating system designed first, and then the outcome will come later. And just lastly, we need to engage our private sector more. The US does this a lot, California does it heavily. We needed to pay for low-income, freer transport for youth. And we asked companies, and Google came up with the money and said, we will pay to give subsidized fares for school-age children, because it's a value for it's a societal value, but it's also a business value for us as a company. And so we now use that as a requirement when we talk to all the cities and to the companies and say, can you invest in our transport system together? And one example is we have a large development that's just opening up, and Uber is offering $100 a month to people to use the transport system with public transit if they agree to give up their car. So if you agree to give up your car, you get a $100 mobility budget towards public transport, car sharing, bike sharing, and Uber. That's every month for the rest of their life, as long as you give up the car, right? So these are experiments that we're testing in the city by policy. We're asking, can you do this? So it's results driven. Get to this point. We're not going to tell you how to do it, but how to help us get there. Engage the private sector.
A brief word, if you would, on that middle question that we had in terms of, because I think you assented as well when that question was posed about autonomy. And
So all of the autonomous companies are in San Francisco right now. So we have 13 companies that are testing. Thank you for reminding me. We have 13 companies that are testing in San Francisco right now. And the question we're working with all the companies from the get-go is, we need you to design accessibility from the get-go. Let's not make the same mistake we did with our car companies. For 50 years, they've ignored accessibility, and our bus companies finally got to it in the late 90s. But let's do it now. And so we're working with Google and Zoox and all these other car companies saying that you need to be able to bring in accessibility. And we're not talking about wheelchair accessibility. People who are over 85 years old, they can't get in a seat and they can't get out very easily. So does the seat need to have hydraulics to lift people up and out? These are new ideas of designs that we haven't even thought of yet, but if we can design it from the get-go, we should be able to make sure that it's not a problem in their cost model.
Thanks very much. So let me go now to Moscow, and may I ask that the remaining comments be very, very brief, because we're over time. Thanks.
Хотел бы ответить.
I would also like to answer the question what the challenges are for the transport systems, and also the question to do with modern technologies, for instance, autonomous driving, and what we do in Moscow. In Moscow, we did a study what a car company, the average car company pays for advertising. For instance, your car is better than public transport. This is a status symbol. This is to do with your living standard. And we saw that about $1 billion are spent every year by the car companies. So on television, in newspapers, so in the media, basically asking people to buy a private car. Then we had a look at bus companies, at bus makers and tram makers, and what they spend on advertising. Because public transport, after all, is something comfortable and modern, so there needs to be advertising as well. But zero money is spent on that, zilch. And so you see that information is key. We lose the information fight, and we lag behind the car makers as far as the advertising budget is concerned. So to the vendors of buses, trams, and so on, we say they should do advertising for their services as well and for their product. And it makes sense to do advertising in this respect. And maybe we will spend some money as well in order to make progress. So to have commercials and advertising for public transport as well. Also, we've got Wi-Fi in all underground carriages, about 5,000 carriages, in fact. And by the end of this year, all means of transport will have public Wi-Fi. So this is one thing that we say. If you use public transport, you can check your emails, you can read on the internet, you can chat with your friends. So public transport is now more interesting for people than private cars. So, but we need to analyze matters, of course, and we have to keep that in mind. So advertising is also important. And autonomous trains or new technologies, we look towards Paris and their experiences. In Paris, they do have autonomous underground trains, but modern technology still have a long way to go. At peak times, the frequency for trains is 90 seconds. So for suburban trains and underground trains is 90 seconds. And autonomous trains is still 2.5 minutes, so we need a higher frequency of trains like that. But we hope that technology will catch up and that matters will improve, also for autonomous trains.
Thank you very much. And I think that I will just assume that there is general agreement with much of what Mary Krass said in terms of strengthening the national government involvement, not only in putting the legislation in place, but then actually also providing the wherewithal for follow-through. Unless anybody has a burning need to comment on that, I would suggest we let that as a comment stand. And then I would simply, yes, please.
Einsatz.
One thing I would like to say. Of course, standards are important, but we don't really have a problem financing inclusion. What is important is that the whole public transport system needs new financing models. So inclusiveness is not a problem. But we need financing in the spirit of solidarity, and we are left to our own devices. Mr. van der Ploeg has also said that. Monsieur Negre. Just very briefly, just 2 or 3 things. In France, that is used a lot, namely opportunities for mobility impaired people. And this is about all sorts of people, like elderly people as well, or people who are particularly prone to have accidents. So it's not just wheelchair-bound people. And this is important. And when we understand that, we can take measures accordingly. And another thing, you have mentioned it, since 1995, there has been a law, and that law was revised in 2005. And the French government said by 2025, as far as I remember, when when municipalities don't come up to their duties, they have to pay. You talked about pollution. The degree of motorization, this is one of the richest cities, is 50%. Why is that the case? Why do we have this percentage? We have a very dense network of public transport, so you don't have to use your car anymore. Of course, there are new kinds of powertrains, new fuels, so there are new technologies in this respect as well. So in a few years' time, we will have a low CO2 town. We will bank on electric mobilities, on hybrid vehicles. So those are new things which we want to use. And I would also like to add, in developed countries, we have to keep in mind that there are people with impairments. And so we should also consider other countries as well, lesser developed countries, where public transport is still not so well developed. We have a certain program in this respect. I'm a member of an NGO, and we help 40 cities in lesser developed countries, where we want to make sure that they have inclusive transport systems as well. We look after this program and its implementation so that new opportunities are created.
emerging economies and developing countries, and in the end it was not possible. So thank you at least for that very brief mention of the need to keep an eye on developments there as well. Thanks so much to all of our panelists for this very interesting exchange. Many thanks to you in the audience for your attention and your contributions. May we please give the panel now a very warm round of applause. And thanks up in the booth to our translators who've been working very, very hard up there to help us. Thanks so much. And I wish everyone good last sessions at the summit, and wish you much success in your work, and hope to see you again next year at the ITF. Bye-bye.